In the last hard winter of the war, when rumors of peace traveled faster than pay and slower than hunger, a compact, careful New Jersey lawyer with a Huguenot name took the chair of Congress and tried to carry a country across the narrow bridge between victory and legitimacy. Elias Boudinot did not have the theatrical silhouette of a general or the lapidary sentences of a pamphleteer. He had, instead, a habit of exactness, a tenderness for procedures that protect the weak, and a talent for guiding a room without scalding it. In November 1782, the delegates elected him President of the United States in Congress assembled, an office that was mostly gavel and very little scepter. And for the next 12 months, Boudinot presided over a string of decisions that would decide whether the United States could turn a battlefield triumph into a government other nations would trust. The work seldom looked heroic while he was doing it. It looked like letters answered on time, soldiers coaxed back from fury to patience, treaties shepherded through etiquette as intricate as lace. And when the Republic came near humiliation in its own capital, a firm hand on the tiller that steered Congress out of danger without making fresh enemies. If the revolutionary decade can be read as the passage from improvisation to institutions, Boudinot's year in the chair is one of the moments when that passage became visible in the angle of a pen and the timing of a proclamation. He had been training for such work without knowing it since the day he learned to sign his name. Born in 1740 in Philadelphia to parents of French Protestant descent, he grew up in a household where the memory of religious flight and the discipline of merchant ledgers sat side by side on the same shelf. The Huguenot inheritance lent his mind a habit of conscience. The Delaware Valley's polyglot commerce taught him that conscience is useless if it cannot be made legible in contracts. He studied law in the office of Richard Stockton at Princeton, married Stockton's sister, Hannah, and built a practice in Elizabethtown that touched the whole range of colonial trouble: disputed titles, debts that needed to become schedules, quarrels that needed to become language. He was pious without affectation and sociable without vanity, a combination that made him welcome in rooms where Presbyterians argued about doctrine and in taverns where traders argued about price. The Stamp Act did not so much radicalize him as clarify his instincts. He disliked gratuitous power the way a precise craftsman dislikes a dull blade. Taxation without representation was not only an affront to a citizen. It was an insult to a lawyer's sense that authority must have warrant. When the quarrel with Britain shifted from petition to organization, Boudinot did not paint slogans on walls. He entered committees, he raised subscriptions, and when war arrived, he took one of the least glamorous and most morally exacting posts in the Patriot machine: Commissary General of Prisoners under Washington, a job that asked him to mind the exchange of captives and the condition of men who were in the enemy's hands, and therefore in danger of becoming invisible. In that role, he wrote letters that have the tone of a man who believes documents can be instruments of mercy. He pressed the British for exchanges when he could, for relief when he could not. He inspected American prisons as if the Republic's character could be read in how it treated a Hessian corporal with a fever. It is easy to romanticize that posture from a safe distance. The work at the time tasted of mildew and compromise. You begged men you despised to let someone live one more week. You asked your own side to keep a promise even when the other had broken one. Out of that drudgery, Boudinot drew a conviction that would shape his politics even when the guns fell silent. A government is what it does with the powerless and with paper. He also served in Congress before he took the chair, first in 1777 and again in 1781, learning the geometry of a national body that had to pretend to be a government before it could really be one. He watched men of genius draft resolutions that states ignored, saw committees accomplish in a day what speeches could not in a month, and learned which forms mattered to foreign ministries even when they bored militia captains. He built friendships across regions, carried Washington's trust as an honest broker, and acquired the reputation that makes colleagues think of you when a meeting needs a moderator who does not stall at the sound of his own voice. When the delegates voted him into the presidency on November 4, 1782, they were not voting for a philosophy of government so much as for a temperament, a man who could absorb a flood of business without drowning, who would not mistake a chair for a throne, and who could say no without saying enemy. The hour was delicate. Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown the previous October, but the British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah. The war was over in the way that a storm is over when it has passed you and is beating your neighbor's roof. The damage still remained, and so did the possibility that a sudden gust would pull the shingles off again. American envoys in Paris, Franklin, Jay, Adams, and Lawrence, were inching toward a preliminary agreement with Britain. France had its own priorities, Spain another set still. The American army sat in winter quarters, shivering with more than cold. Pay had not arrived in years that soldiers could count. Promises of half pay for life rang hollow to men who did not own enough life yet to mortgage it. In that setting, a president's most powerful tool was a calendar. Boudinot made the calendar work for him. He insisted that dispatches be read, referred, reported back, and converted into action with a speed that, under the article's poverty of coercive power, amounted to a kind of substitute authority. Washington's letters about supply, about the new plague of counterfeit currency, about the impatience building in the officer corps, these did not vanish into respectable silence. They returned from committee with language that moved wagons and authorized the superintendent of finance, Robert Morris, to improvise again on an empty keyboard. When Morris urged Congress to adopt a better revenue plan, an impost on imports, and an apportionment of interior taxes that might at last give the Union a bloodstream, Boudinot's chair did not write the votes, but it did hold the room to the question. He sent the circular letters out clean and earnest, and he kept sending them when states equivocated. He understood, earlier than some and later than others, that fiscal credibility is a moral matter as well as a mathematical one. You cannot keep a republic's self-respect if you cannot keep its promises to its soldiers. He presided when the news from Paris finally arrived that negotiators had agreed to preliminary articles of peace on November 30th, 1782. There was no trumpet. There were clauses, boundaries drawn along rivers, and lines through forests none of the men in the room had seen with their own eyes, rights to fish on the Grand Banks, provisions for creditors to be paid, soft injunctions about the treatment of those who had remained loyal to the crown. The preliminary nature of the thing mattered. France, America's ally, was still at war. The British king had not yet sent a definitive peace. The shape of the world was visible through tracing paper. In that grayness, Boudinot's task was to give a population weary of sacrifice enough hope to restrain its anger, and enough accuracy to keep its hope from floating away. He oversaw the proclamations of a cessation of hostilities in April 1783, after the British and American commanders signaled that shooting could stop. He signed the orders that turned a rumor into a regimen. Lay down arms, but keep the magazines. Dismiss nothing until peace is more than a draft. In March 1783, the room over which he presided trembled, though the tremor began up the Hudson. The Newburgh addresses, anonymous, eloquent, incendiary, circulated among officers, calling on them to use the threat of a mass resignation or a march on the civil power to force justice for their pay and pensions. The prospect that the army might become a faction, and then something worse, that the revolution might die of the disease that had killed so many republics before it, suddenly seemed less like rhetoric and more like tomorrow morning. Washington's speech to his officers, with its famous moment when he took out his spectacles and said he had grown gray and blind in their service, gave the conspiracy a decent exit. But language alone could not hold men who had accounts to settle and children to feed. They needed Congress to mean what it had said. Under Boudinot, the delegates passed measures that converted the open-ended promise of half pay for life into a commutation of 5 years full pay, an imperfect attempt to meet dignity with numbers. It would not satisfy everyone. Anger would smolder all the way to a later mutiny. But it was not nothing. It was the attempt of a legislative body without taxes to keep faith with men who held muskets. What happened next in Philadelphia is the kind of test that reveals whether a chair is merely a piece of furniture. In June 1783, several hundred soldiers, most of them from Pennsylvania, many of them drunk, all of them desperate, marched into the city and ringed the State House where Congress sat. They demanded redress and hinted at violence. The state's executive council temporized. The city militia hesitated. Congress, frightened and insulted, asked the state for protection and received talk for a shield. Boudinot, responsible for the safety of the delegates and the dignity of the government, could see the disaster forming, a national legislature cowed by its own soldiers, while the state that hosted it looked away. He recommended adjournment and removal. Within days, Congress decamped across the Delaware to Princeton and took up its sessions in a college hall. A move that would provoke constitutional debates in later generations, and that at the moment did the essential thing. It showed that the center would not sit still to be bullied. The decision was practical. Not a single guard to command, not a single reliable company to summon, and political. It signaled to every state that the national body would not beg for safety from a government unwilling to provide it. There is a photograph in the Mines album, though no camera took it, of Boudinot walking out of Philadelphia with the minutes of Congress packed in a chest. He did not allow panic to write the story. He let prudence do it. From Nassau Hall, he presided over a Congress, learning how to be smaller and harder. He sent thanks to Washington and farewells to officers with language that honored service without courting mutiny. He managed the etiquette of the French alliance as it shifted from war footing to peacetime friendship. He monitored relations with the British command in New York as evacuation became conceivable. He urged once more the adoption of a revenue system equal to the needs of peace, knowing that without money, the United States would collapse into a market open to everyone's goods and no one's respect. He was not naive about what the Articles could not do, but he believed that forms, properly used, could push men to decency. He also understood the longer horizon, and he made room for it even while fires still burned. During his year, the machinery of westward surveying and cession creaked into motion. The question of how to turn claims on maps into Republican geography, how to apportion land, how to treat the indigenous nations who lived on it, how to avoid creating proprietary empires for the largest states, was not solved in 1783. But Boudinot helped see to it that the questions remained attached to Congress, not merely to land-hungry legislatures. His earlier support for Maryland's insistence on Western cessions gave him a credibility in these talks that a Virginian might not have enjoyed. He could speak about the commons without being suspected of angling for local advantage. He never pretended that the Republic had figured out how to be just on the frontier. He insisted only that the Republic keep the problem within the reach of its laws, rather than abandon it to speculation's appetite. Part of what steadied him in these months was the inner life that had steadied him all along. He prayed as men of his time prayed, not to secure advantage, but to keep pride from winning. He read Scripture as if it were a guide to paperwork as well as to salvation. He thought civic mercy, how you treat a debtor, how you feed a prisoner, a form of piety. There is a line that runs from the commissary's ledger, where he made sure British captives did not starve, to the Princeton minutes, where he made sure American creditors did not rule. To him, each was a part of the same work, insisting that liberty without law is a shout, and law without mercy is a cage. He stepped down at the end of his term in November 1783, obeying the rotation that kept the presidency of Congress from calcifying into habit. Within weeks, on evacuation day, British troops marched out of New York to ships in the harbor. Within a month, Washington resigned his commission to Congress at Annapolis in a gesture so poised and so rare in the history of power that even a lawyer's pen can tremble writing it down. Boudinot was not in the chair for that relinquishment, but he had helped make it politically possible. by keeping the army's rage from poisoning the civil peace, by keeping Congress's spine straight when Philadelphia ducked, by refusing to let the promise of peace unbraid the alliance before the treaty was inked. His life after the chair offers its own lesson in the kind of ambition that keeps its eye on service instead of on monuments. He returned to New Jersey and then to national work as Secretary of Foreign Affairs briefly, and later as a member of the first Federal House of Representatives under the new Constitution. In those years, he served again in the role that fit him best, a steady man in the middle who believed that a nation's credit is its character written in numbers. He supported the federal government's assumption of state debts. He favored a national bank. He voted for measures that gave the new executive the tools Boudinot had lacked in the old chair, because he had learned in Philadelphia and Princeton what happens when a government must beg to act. He defended religious liberty in ways that went beyond the generic. He argued in print that Jews should be welcomed into the obligations and protections of citizenship, a position that sounds ordinary to later ears, but in his time could still provoke unease. He freed some of the people his household had claimed as property and gave money and voice to early abolitionist societies in New Jersey. He was not a prophet on race. He would not have praised uprisings or immediate uncompensated emancipation, but he bore, as he aged, the sense that the phrases he had signed, about rights and about the consent of the governed, obliged him to a widening circle. In 1795, Washington appointed him director of the Mint, a post so perfectly suited to his convictions that it reads like a joke the cosmos made kindly. There he supervised the coinage of the young country's metal promises, battling counterfeiting and confusion, keeping records as if arithmetic were a language that must be spoken honestly if the polity is to look itself in the eye. The Mint under Boudinot did not sparkle, it balanced. The very coins he sent into circulation, eagles and dollars, cents with their little symbols of liberty, carried forward his belief that national identity is hammered into use, not just composed in declarations. In his last decades, he turned more and more of his time and his purse toward the institutions that form private character rather than public budgets. He helped found the American Bible Society and served as its first president, not to marry church and state, but to encourage the sort of inner discipline that makes citizens keep their promises when no one is looking. He supported schools and missionary work among native peoples, with a conviction that can look paternalist and can also look like an attempt to make reconciliation thinkable. And he gave a name to a boy in Cherokee country that the boy would carry to Washington as the spokesman for a nation in peril, Elias Boudinot. The Cherokee statesman, born Galagina, took his name from the old Huguenot lawyer after the two met in a circle of benevolent patrons. There is irony in that line of inheritance, and there is tenderness too. A man who had spent a career turning no one into someone in the eyes of an indifferent empire lent his own name to a young diplomat who would plead with a new empire to remember its laws. But the hour in which the contour of Boudinot's usefulness is sharpest remains that single year when the war hung between ending and ended. Think again about the roster of problems that lay under his pen. A half-starved army tempted by a conspiracy's logic, a treasury built of paper and hope, allies watching for slights in every salute and for steadiness in every letter, enemies looking for fissures to widen before peace became treaty. A capital city where a handful of angry men could convince officials to look at their boots. Boudinot's most striking acts in that year are not theatrical. They are administrative courage, the resolve to lift a legislature and move it rather than let it be humiliated, the insistence that promises to soldiers be converted into numbers intelligible to merchants, the ability to turn news of a preliminary agreement into a public posture that stopped short of premature jubilation and fell short, too, of paralyzing caution. We do not usually erect statues to that kind of courage, because it is made of patience and foresight instead of risk and blood. But a country that does not honor it will one day go broke in every coin that matters. He was not a perfect man, and the republic he nurtured was never close to perfect. His piety did not prevent him from inhabiting a society that profited from bondage. His gentleness in the commissary's ledgers did not save all the men whose names he wrote. His care for public credit did not provide public plenty. He made choices that would disappoint radicals and alarm skeptics. He trusted gradualism more than ruptures. He believed that habits change a nation more reliably than manifestos do. He worried about disorder more than about hierarchy. He could be punctilious in ways that irritated men who preferred to call the future down from the sky rather than to build it one rule at a time. And yet there is a line to be drawn from his clerks' neat lines to the institutions that survive storms, courts that function when tempers fail, mints that issue sound money when rhetoric has gone brittle, legislative bodies that know when to stand up and leave a dangerous city rather than discover their dignity at gunpoint. It is tempting, writing about him, to let the year of his presidency be swallowed by the more famous scenes that bracket it: Yorktown before and Washington's resignation after, the fireworks and the exit. The temptation should be resisted because the passage between those scenes, the crossing of a frail bridge over a fast river, is where states reveal what they are made of. Boudinot did not build the bridge alone, but he held the ropes steady while a wounded army and a worried Congress walked across. He was the presence in the chair who refused to mistake adolescent bravado for manly courage when unpaid soldiers banged their muskets on Philadelphia's stones. He was the signature at the bottom of the page that told the world the shooting had stopped, but the law had not. He was the temper that treated allies as if friendship were a practice rather than a pose. To recount his year is to be reminded that the American experiment, if it is to be sustained, depends as much on that species of character as on genius or on arms. He died in 1821 at the age of 81, having lived long enough to see the new constitutional order steady itself and then strain under new pressures, long enough to watch a second generation argue about banks and boundaries in a language that would have sounded familiar to him, and long enough to take comfort in institutions he had helped make ordinary. If the light that history casts on him is softer than the light it casts on men who built armies or constitutions, it is because his craft takes place in the shade by design. The President of Congress under the Articles was meant to disappear into the institution he served, to make continuity more visible than personality. Boudinot did that with an almost liturgical grace. He preserved the sense that a national body could meet and decide and adjourn and meet again without dissolving into gusts of anger or vanity. He made procedures feel like promises kept. Stand, if you like, in the imagination's Princeton and watch him rise in Nassau Hall, the windows rattling a little when carts roll past, the painted portrait of a king ironically hung above a Republican bench. He calls the roll. He asks for the report of a committee on the Army's commutation. He recognizes a delegate who has come up from Maryland with news that a harbor is clearing of British ships. He folds a letter from Franklin, with its exquisite French compliments and its paragraphs of hard instruction. He signs a proclamation for a day of Thanksgiving that will not buy a single loaf, but that will help a poor people remember how to say the word we. There is not much about such a scene that answers to our appetite for dramatic climax. But if you want to know why there was any country to dramatize later, why papers could be exchanged in Paris and soldiers laid down arms without a civil war opening under their feet, the answer is in the atmospheric pressure of such hours, held steady by a man whose name is a quiet sentence about the civic virtues that build durable things. The habit of telling the story of the American presidency as if it begins with a hand on a Bible and ends with a motorcade cheats us of the genealogy that gave that ritual its meaning. Before there was an oath like that, there was the other office, humbler and harder to love, where men like Elias Boudinot kept the idea of a national head from turning into a national headstrong. He did not command an army, he commanded a meeting. He did not wield a veto. He wielded a docket. He did not appoint judges, he appointed times. He did not draft a constitution, he practiced one before it existed. If you want to trace the lines that connect that chair to the later one and understand how the latter avoided, at least for a while, becoming a stage for Caesar, follow his hands as they smoothed a paper, his voice as it steadied a vote, and his decision when danger outshouted decorum in the Capitol, to move the nation's business rather than let the nation's business be moved by fear. What he did, in the end, was make the idea of a United States feel like an institution rather than a weather report. What he failed to do were the things no one could do under the Articles: raise taxes without consent, enforce a requisition with marshals, conjure plenty out of honor. Between those two facts, his competence and his limits, you can see the shape of the country that would soon write a stronger frame for itself. It is worth being grateful that, in the meantime, the frame it had was held together by hands like his.